Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and welcome to the 4th episode of The Critical Corner. Now, if you're new to this series, The Critical Corner is a series where I talk about, in shorter form, all albums or all movies. I give my opinion on things that I've missed, on either movies or albums that I missed, and today I am focusing entirely on albums, since the last episode was focused entirely on movies. So, let's not waste any more time, and let's go ahead and get into our first album.
Who needs to go to sleep when I got you next to me?
Pop albums can really be a bit of a hit and miss situation, but Dua Lipa's newest is really a hit almost all the way through. There are so many fun tracks on this album, especially Physical, which is probably my favorite track on the album and will most likely be one of my favorite songs of the year. I just love the 80s vibe this album has throughout. It just really has a fun time with every song, and it's very danceable, very fun to listen to. And I think Dua Lipa is just very confident in the vocal department. She exudes this real charisma and swagger that not a whole lot of pop artists can do as well as her. And there's just so many good moments on here. Levitating has this great backing beat. Break My Heart has some of the most fun bass grooves I've heard all year, and Don't Start Now still proves to be an extremely catchy lead single that hasn't left my head since the first time I heard it, and will most likely be one of my favorite hit songs of the year. I would definitely recommend this album, even to those who aren't pop fans, because there's some real instrumentation in here. There's even some songs that have a bit of a rockier influence to them, especially Cool and Levitating. So I think this album can appeal to almost anyone, and I just think it's a release that I'll be coming back to even more as the year goes on. It's already been one of my most returned to albums of the year, and I envision it will continue to be that way. So I give this album a very strong 4 out of 5 stars, with a strong recommendation, even to people who may think that this album isn't for them.
Sidewalk, slapping my leg with the riding crop, thinking it made me come off so tough. I didn't smile because a smile always seemed rehearsed. I wasn't afraid of the bullies.
I feel like a short review probably won't do Fiona Apple's newest Fetch the Bolt Cutters much justice, but there's just so much to say about this album and not nearly enough time to talk about everything that I like about it. This is easily one of the best albums of the year, and I haven't even heard of Fiona Apple before. I've always heard really good stuff about this artist, but I've never really taken the opportunity to get into her. There are so many compelling tracks on here, the title track being a primary one of them, and Shamika has just this really fun piano playing in it. One of the most chaotic yet most enjoyable songs I've listened to all year. I love how Fiona Apple tells stories in this album. I really think she has a compelling narrative voice and is really able to tell some interesting ideas and some interesting anecdotes about her own life, and she's able to do it in different ways on each song. This album's biggest highlight comes in the song For Her, which is a haunting reflection on sexual assault, and the lyrics are so abrasive and so in your face that they can feel a little uncomfortable at times. There are so many interesting things that happen, including this incredibly bizarre beat switch up that comes out of nowhere and still knocks me off my feet every time I hear it because it's just so crazy. But as a whole, this album is simply great, talking about relationships in a much more interesting way than a lot of albums I've heard this year. Very strong 4 out of 5 for this release. I might upgrade it to a 4.5 out of 5 at some point. Thankfully, most of my reviews for this episode of The Critical Corner are very positive, and the same goes for Trivium's newest release, What the Dead Men Say. I've been a fan of Trivium since Silence in the Snow, which I still think is a good album, but despite how controversial it is within the fan base. But Trivium did improve with their follow-up album, The Sin in the Sentence, which really did a good job of combining all their sounds into one album and becoming really intense at moments, really melodic at others, and overall, it was just one of Trivium's best releases to date. Now, I wouldn't say that What the Dead Men Say is as good as The Sin in the Sentence, but it actually comes a lot closer than I thought it would have. This album did take a couple of listens to grow on me, especially because of some of the songs that I was having complicated feelings on, but as I listened to the album more and more, man, the more it absolutely grew on me. Catastrophist is easily one of my top 5 songs of the year so far. I just love how the song progresses, having so many different changes in musical structure and having some of the best guitar work and drum work that Trivium has ever seen. Also, Amongst the Shadows and the Stones feels dishearteningly relevant to right now, just bleeding this raw anger at government corruption, and really being one of Trivium's most angry songs to date, and having some of their most intense metalcore elements ever. I love Matt Heffy's screams on this, and man, the guitar and drum work is just absolutely furious and throttling in every moment. I would say there are a couple of weak points, such as Lead to Me, which is a pretty generic radio single. It feels very radio ready, and there's not much to say about it. Also, Sickness Unto You, while I think it starts out interesting, it does overstay its welcome. But still, What the Dead Men Say is yet another great album in Trivium's overall really stellar discography, so I'm going to give it a very strong 4 out of 5 stars, with a very high recommendation, especially for those who are metal fans and want to see the best of what the genre has to offer. Alright, next up is Dance Gavin Dance's newest album, Afterburner. I don't really know how to feel about this album, but then again, I've never quite known how to feel about Dance Gavin Dance as a band. I just don't really know if they're for me, and I think with this newest album, I've sort of decided that they're not really my type of band, which is okay. There are some moments on this album that do work for me, such as the track Parody Catharsis, which I do think is one of the best songs of the year, and has a really interesting commentary on how the band members put their pain out for fans to see, but it can sometimes feel like they're putting on a show, or that they don't really mean it. But as a whole, this album just didn't really work for me. I feel like it's mainly mediocre, and songs like Calentamiento Global just don't work. I don't really know what the band was trying to do with that song. It seems like they were trying to combine reggaeton with metal, and it is a real disaster. And plus, the lyrics are really cringe. It's one of the worst songs of the year. And the rest of the album, there's some hits, there's some misses. Overall, this album just didn't work for me much, and I just don't think I'll be returning to the band soon. I was just trying to see if I could get into them maybe one more time, because I always try to do that with bands, but I think this is probably the last time that I'm going to listen to them. Slight 3 out of 5 stars. It's not really for me, but if it's for you, you'll definitely like it as much as you've enjoyed other Dance Gavin Dance albums. I can say that much. Right, next up is Boston Manor's Glue, which is going to definitely be one of my favorite albums of the year. I've really gotten into Boston Manor. With every album, I feel like they've improved on their sound. I've seen a lot of people criticize the second single, Everything is Ordinary, but I actually think it's a pretty solid way to start out the album, and it has an interesting way of distorting the lead singer's vocals, and that chorus really does get in my head every time I think about it. Liquid is still probably the best song on the album, in my opinion. It was one of my favorite songs of 2019 because it did come out last year, but I still think it's the best song in context of the album. That doesn't mean that there aren't other songs that are highlights too or come close to Liquid. I think that Rat King is incredibly furious and incredibly fun to listen to, and has one of the coolest choruses I've heard all year long. And You, Me, and the Class War comes in a close second to Liquid, with this super intense guitar riff that keeps on repeating throughout the song, and then that ending really sends the chills up your spine as the lead singer repeats over and over, "This isn't love, this is a class war," getting more and more furious with each iteration of saying that. And there are other great songs on here too, such as "On a High Ledge," which does a good job at detailing this tragic, toxic masculinity that sends this person to literally the edge and to contemplating suicide. And then there's Ones and Zeros with a chorus that just screams this ferocity that I don't think Boston Manor has ever shown before. So overall, Glue is simply a great album that I think is more than worth your time, and I'm going to be returning to it a lot throughout the year. It's going to probably be within my top 10 albums of the year, and for good reason. Very strong 4 out of 5 stars for me.
Turn it into a fire escape.
And finally, we have what was one of my most anticipated albums of the year, Hayley Williams of Paramore fame, with her debut solo album, Petals for Armor. I really hate to say this, but this album was a bit of a disappointment to me. Now, it's not terrible by any means, but it's not that great either. First of all, I think this album was a little bit too long at 15 tracks. There is a lot of fluff in this album, especially with tracks that are repeating this idea of using flowers as a metaphor for blooming or for growth or for coming into one's own. And while I like the metaphor, and I think it's showed in some compelling ways on some songs, on others it just feels really repetitive and unnecessary. And there are other tracks on here that are just not super interesting on their own, like Cinnamon, which seems to be trying to copy this Fiona Apple style of using a lot of percussive elements, but it doesn't really come together and is one of the most bizarre lyrical moments of the album. And yet for every weak moment on the album, there is one that's really strong to me, such as Simmer, which was a really great lead single, or Leave It Alone, which is probably my favorite moment on the album, talking about this really tragic idea of a loved one losing themselves and everyone around them seeing them losing a part of them that belonged or defined them. I wish more tracks had compelling ideas like this one. I also think Dead Horse was a really good self-aware track where Hayley talked about how this relationship she was in was doomed to fail, and yet she still tried to keep this relationship alive even though she was beating it like a dead horse over and over again. As a whole, I wish I liked this album more, I really do, but it honestly just didn't stand out to me a whole lot. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to give it a slight 3 out of 5 stars. And there we have it. There is the latest episode of the Critical Corner. What were your thoughts on any of the albums that I mentioned? Let me know in the comments down below. Once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please be sure to like this video and to subscribe to my channel for future content. And until then, I will see you all in the next video.